don't think there's ever been a more significant time in the US to talk about autism. And right now, this conversation is so disheartening every day. I want to stick to the facts here and to what I'm learning, and also to share with you that we are still vastly understudied in terms of autism and high masking in women and girls, in anyone who is a marginalized human being who does not fit in a very specific box. And though their research is growing, we still have a lot we need to understand. But I want to share with you today that how many times people post and say, I truly believe I'm autistic, and my therapist, my clinician, my doctor doesn't believe me or doesn't understand it. And the research shows that a very, very large and vast percentage of clinicians, I would say if they're not active on social media especially, think that everything that is autism, only if it aligns with, playing with trains, being a white male, and flapping your hands in the DSM-5, like for the most part, and or significant, intellectual difficulties, which that's important, absolutely, and we need way more resources for higher support needs, way more. But there aren't enough wherever you are on the spectrum. But when it really comes down to it, people feel very invalidated. And I'm telling you, that has changed my life. And I've wrestled with it. I've shared it here. Like for the longest time, I think it's a very autistic trait to spend years and hours and months and researching it, and yet to still be like, am I? It seems to be common. So today I want to go through 12 of the very commonly missed signs of autism taken together. Remember, we're talking about not each one of these separately. We're talking about collectively as we talk about a lifetime, although it may not have gotten difficult for you until your social world became more demanding. We're talking about not just trauma, because trauma and autism are so deeply intertwined, but we're talking about when you fit under the collection of social and emotional and sensory challenges, repetitive behaviors, routine behaviors, things like that. So in today's video, I've had, like I said, so many people say that my clinician doesn't believe me. I want to share what often this looks like, and maybe you'll share this video with them if they are someone who wants to know more. Of course, they have to spend their own time researching, but I want to validate what the clinical profile looks like for today's video, the female phenotype of autism. But anyone can have this, okay? This is coming from some recent research in Sarah Hendrick's book and a bunch of other research papers on autistic traits in women and girls. And I am talking here about high masking and level 1, generally speaking, but the research is not just for level 1. So I'm going to give you the broad research, okay? Number 1, you have to understand there's a vast and wide gender bias, as I just mentioned, in not only the diagnosis, but in the diagnostic criteria and all of the assessment tools. Diagnosing autism can be a very subjective process. There is no this box, this study, you're autistic. It relies on informed and trained clinicians. And that's great if they were informed and trained a decade ago. But if they are not really having their hands in the world of autism, they may not see someone who, like me or other people who have great masking, camouflaging skills and high functioning. And so this idea that you don't look autistic, I always do this, is a problem, because it used to be, I've had clients still say, well, I have empathy and I can make eye contact. Many, many, many autistic people have been trained, especially if they're camouflaging, to make eye contact. In fact, we make sure we do that. Also, empathy, it turns out there's a very internalized presentation of autism, which can line up, not does always, but can be one of the flavors of the female phenotype, where we can be overly empathic, overly sensitive to the world around us and people and all of that, okay? So the problem is, if you're looking for what they call, the classic autism presentation, you're not going to see it. In fact, many autistic people know how to appear specifically, typical in the world. That is the heart of camouflaging. So please research that. Understand that if you've grown up in a world that has taught you that you aren't seen through your autistic lens, that it's okay to have these autistic traits, but to be not considered to have any kind of difficulty, meanwhile your whole life has been challenging. This is an important thing to understand. So the tools, even right now, the last thing I want to say is, even right now, a large percentage of clinicians who are still not in the loop in terms of this diagnosis, but also even among many who do, they're not using gender-specific tools. Well, that's a problem if you're looking at people who don't get seen. In fact, like Black women are even even way more invisible, obviously, for many reasons than white women in terms of testing. It's like, and it's going to present in each of us in some different flavors and ways. So please, 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 if someone comes to you and says they think they have this, documenting it is one thing, like I'm saying, but understanding it is really powerful and impactful, especially when you look at the interventions and how you approach someone. Number two, there is a significant overlap with people that have eating. If I say this word here, it affects the views in some way. So, but I mean, there's a very large percentage. If your client or someone you know has a history of anything related to that and behaviors and body, all of that, please take that into consideration. Number three, a massive history of raging anxiety. So almost always, not always, but in large part, it's not fair, but I would say especially among women and girls, you're going to see something that looks like generalized anxiety disorder, right? It's going to look like anxiety, right, left, center, and sideways, out of nowhere all the time. And that can be part of the nervous system, the brain. It can also be part of masking and camouflaging. And that can also be why we like to be alone, which I'll get to that. Number four, a lot of people, when they come to you and they're self-reporting and they're saying, look, I identify with all these symptoms and here's how and here's when. That is a very important factor, regardless of whether or not. Now, if you're really trained in this, and you're like, look, and you can counter back with, well, that could be this and this could be that. Sure. But remember, autism is a flavor. It's a neurotype of the brain. It's not like we're from another planet. You're going to see human behaviors. They're just going to play out in a different way, a different expression, different processing and things like that. So trust your self-reports. Trust the people that give you self-report. Number five, many autistic people, and this is actually in the newer book I just got, talks about girls and women being very, not always, I was always going to say this, but if you have a client or you are someone who's always deeply immersed in science fiction, in reading, in the fantasy world, and I would say also, I would add self-help. What I've noticed is a lot of autistic girls love specifically like Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, not all, I'm just talking about in my very, very small bubble, but in many ways that you wouldn't classically expect, right? Or if there's a lot of trending fiction now in the sci-fi world. But this idea of fantasy and literature and psychology and understanding yourself, like I've been buying self-help books since I was like probably 18 or 19. And so this deep dive to understand the brain, and that part can be about trying to understand human behavior. Human behavior might be their special interest. And one of the things about the sci-fi world that seems to be appealing to many autistic girls and women is there's a specific set of rules for that universe. So there are like boundaries, right? There's like, I know what this is supposed to look like. And that can be part of the problem when you have a brain that is taking in all of the data, all the social dynamics, and has a harder time knowing that, oh, this cue means that and whatever, things like that. Number six is a trauma history. You're going to see almost always autistic women and girls, and anyone autistic is going to have some form of trauma, from their family trauma with undiagnosed parents to their social world, their community, their school, their siblings, right? Whatever it is, and or also PTSD kind of trauma, not just relational trauma, but we know that autistic people are much more likely to develop trauma from what's called mild stressors. So things that would not create stress for a neurotypical person can create trauma, but you're going to see a trauma history. Number seven is you're going to see hypervigilance. Now, I love this. This is my topic. My book is about this. There's a chapter in my book on traumatism. It's not coming out till 2027, so don't worry. I'm not trying to sell you a book right now. But I'll be talking more and more about this. But hypervigilance, what I've realized is it really is the big connector for many autistic and traumatized people. Now, it might look a little different. It could be similar if you had eggshell parents and you're autistic, but also there could be a lot of like scripting, a lot of ruminating beforehand, a lot of planning, what am I going to say? Where are we going to go? What are we going to do? A lot of assessing the environment, right? For actual triggers, for social dynamics. And you can see a lot of pattern recognition. A lot of autistics will say, well, I thought that was my pattern recognition, which can be very strong in autistic people. So this combination of soaking up other people's moods and emotions and all of that can be both trauma and autism in many regards. And so this dynamic is going to play out in a way that feels often very anxiety driven, very hovering over yourself before, during, and afterwards. So you're going to hear people talk about that, right? That I still thought about that interaction a week later, or I couldn't stop thinking about that one error, or obsessing about an email or a text message with a small error to someone important, right? Where you're like, oh my God, now I've sent, I put there instead of there. And that's like the worst faux pas or whatever. That's like the worst error ever. Number 8 is going to be a lot of previous comorbidities, and they're going to look like, often in women, BPD, ADHD, OCD perhaps, trauma-related disorders, PTSD. And the difference here for the BPD part, for the borderline part, also bipolar, is that for many if you're just straight borderline, you're more likely going to have a fear of abandonment. And it talks about in the literature, that's very common for anyone, right? But also, you can also have this fear of people consuming you too much, which is a more disorganized flavor when you have a mixed attachment pattern. And also for being alone, autistic people are going to be a little more inclined. They're not so afraid of being abandoned. They might be afraid of loneliness and not having friends, but the abandonment is not driven in the same exact way in general. Of course, if there's trauma, all bets are off with like family trauma, parental trauma. And I would say in men now that I really believe this, and I think it's going to keep panning out, and I've seen a lot of people talking about this, but I think a lot of autistic men have been diagnosed as narcissists. And I'm not saying they don't have the trauma piece that has made them the combination, but I think we have to start to like really look at that, because it gets kind of confusing, and it's really easy to chalk everything up to narcissism now. Remember, NPD as a diagnosis is very different than having narcissistic traits or patterns. So just that's an aside. Number 9 is that I just lost my light. Number 9 is that their childhood is probably going to have been complicated, but it would have been even more complicated when they were in adolescence. And so this is when the social demands, especially for any child, but I would say for the really complex nature of girl friendships, can create a lot of difficulty. So we often see a trail of broken friendships. We see girls, on the periphery of friendships. We see a lot of like one bestie at a time situation. But also just like generally, I think a high school for most autistic people is going to be hell. Like it's going to be hell. And I think that those who probably thrive more, who kind of peak, I would guess many of them, once again, not all, are likely more neurotypical because they understood the rules of the game. They could be fake. They could play the game. And I always said, like, I didn't understand being fake, and I wasn't good at it. And so I think that makes a huge difference. But also just everything can manifest with your body and hormones and social dynamics. I don't think it's ever as hard as it is in those 4 years of high school in terms of social demands. Number 10 is this person is often going to camouflage and mask and their whole life, right? There's going to be this sort of like, whether it's they fit in well, they look like it well, they do hair and makeup, but then their clothes or they'll pick out trendy clothes. Their whole vibe is like being a certain aesthetic to fit in. It can be that they've learned to engage certain ways, but it's a mask. And when you're with them in a different environment, you will notice them unmask, hopefully more and more around you. And if you're not aware of it as a clinician, it's really easy to think, oh, this person is like, their affect is flat and they're depressed. They may be. But I've found that most of my clients that I've been working with the last couple of years is that either they come in autistic, which has been great, but I learn every session more and more about autism through them, and watching how some are very much in that, they're on and it's harder for them to turn the volume down. Others are very much like, this is who I am, and they become more that way. But it makes a difference in how you interpret their behavior if you don't understand autism. Number 11, and this is also in the book I found, I just posted this, but many people who are autistic report that prior to the diagnosis, they believe they were HSPs, they were highly sensitive people, they were INFJs on the Myers-Briggs, they're empaths, and I really believe that empaths in particular are, for the most part, traumatized people that were reinforced and taught and rewarded to be caretakers, alongside perhaps being born with a more sensitive and caring and attuned type of, temperament. Like you're just more sensitive in the world. Because being born with a sensitive temperament happens, right? We see it. But the traits of something like HSP and INFJ, they overlap so much with autism, especially with the female phenotype in many cases, that it's pretty hard to say like, this is only HSP and this is only autism. from my perspective. And then lastly, I think you'll see number 12, that a lot of us have parents. When I saw this psychiatrist talking about it on TikTok, saying that when he has clients who come in and they have a narcissistic father, that he sees that as a red flag. And there's a bunch of reasons behind that, not to mention the fact that he may be actually autistic and not narcissistic, or both. But also, I think that there's a lot of trauma at the hands of parents who were undiagnosed themselves. It's like close to like 90% of autism is inherited, right? We know that environmental factors, there's a range of factors, but by and large, it is going to be genetic. And if you have clients who are coming into you and believe they're high masking in like level 1, and you start to really assess how their parents handled conflict, how they handle communication, thinking about the fact that most of our clients, unless they're younger, and I would say, teens to 20s, early 20s, have no awareness. There was not a possibility for us to be diagnosed as women on the spectrum. It didn't even exist because there was no awareness unless we were, presenting in a way that matched the DSM and or often had way more significant difficulties and often intellectual challenges. And in those cases, yes, the girls were diagnosed, but the high masking girls and women were not. So you want to look at could their parents be high masking? Where are their parents? What is the history? And that can be hard. We don't want to diagnose them with anything from a distance, but we all know this. We all make sense of, if I think your mom is a borderline, and we really start to talk about it a lot in therapy, and it really feels like it's possible. I'm not going to ever say that formally, and my clients know I will say this, but it changes how we start to talk about and approach therapy. And also, like, you can tell pretty quickly, because if a client has healthier parents and you start to help them set some boundaries or communicate, the parents generally receive it well. When they have very strong diagnoses of like narcissism, borderline, things like that, and or they're very generationally rigid, you can tell. And so the point is that if you understand that your client most likely inherited this from one or both of their parents, then it also helps you make that clinical picture and take everything I said way more in depth. And so I'll list a few books in the notes down below. You might want to check out if you're someone who wants to learn more, and a few websites. But I hope this was helpful. And number one, I hope if you're someone who just watched all of this and you're like, this is what I have, I hope you felt very validated and seen, because you do matter and it is important. All right. Thanks for being here. Have a great day. Take good care, and I'll see you soon.